you and enjoy the session.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to wherever it is that you're signing in from. And we're very glad to have you join this space. I'm Sachini Pereira. I'm the Executive Coordinator of Research, Realizing Sexual and Reproductive Justice, a South-based Younger Feminist Alliance. And I'm here today with other colleagues from the Global Alliance for Sustainable Feminist Movements, which is a space that brings together governments, donors, and feminist civil society to increase financial and political support for feminist movements. So we are very happy to have you here at our event today. And before I go into more details about the event, I would like to invite Damjan Denkovski, who is the Deputy Executive Director of the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy, to speak a few words about this event and the upcoming summit. Over to you, Damjan.
Thank you very much, Sachini. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. My name is Damjan from the Center for Feminist Foreign Policy. We are a research, advocacy, and consulting organization working to bring an intersectional feminist approach to foreign policy worldwide. This afternoon today, we're delighted to welcome you to the official side event of our summit season, which is a whole calendar of events leading up to the first ever Feminist Foreign Policy Summit, which will take place on the 13th of April this year. The summit will be co-hosted by the governments of Canada, Sweden, and Mexico, the Open Society Foundations, and over 15 civil society organizations, and will constitute an opportunity to bring together the leading thinkers and practitioners in the field of feminist foreign policy to support the exchange of best practices, knowledge, and expertise, to support advocacy efforts for the uptake of feminist foreign policy among new actors, and to take a stand against global inequality and exclusion. During the event, our various panels will cover topics such as climate justice, demilitarization and disarmament, understanding and countering transnational anti-gender campaigns, decolonizing foreign policy, and much, much more. Although in-person participation on the day will be limited, there's also an opportunity to join us virtually. All of the details about our side events and the summit, including information on how to register for virtual participation, can be found on our website, and I will make sure to drop the link in the chat. So for this event on transformative partnerships for funding feminist movements, we are so pleased to be partnering with Global Alliance for Sustainable Feminist Movements, and we will explore what feminist foreign policy and feminist international assistance policies mean. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Damjan. Yeah, so let's jump right in. So like I said before, the Global Alliance for Sustainable Feminist Movements is a multi-stakeholder space. And some of the overarching goals of this alliance are to increase and improve the quality of resources, including but not limited to financial resources that are there to support feminist movements and our collective agendas, and then mobilizing political support for the visibility of various diverse feminist movements, agendas, and policies, especially from the Global South as well. And today, what we are trying to do is really explore the connections between feminist foreign policy and funding and support for feminist movements. So it's not so much about looking at, feminist foreign policy broadly or going, into that, but really looking at, how does, are there connections between how these policies drive funding for feminist movements, and then what is the potential that is there, so that we understand what are the things that we want to collectively mobilize towards. And I think also we have a great set of speakers who are going to bring in their various engagements with this work, whether through governments or through civil society, and I think it'll be as much like a learning space for all of us as it will be for anyone who is attending. So I'll briefly introduce our speakers, and you will see their bios being pasted to the chat if you want to know more about them. We have with us Ambika Vishwanath, who is a founder director of the Kubanine initiative in India. Then we have Memory Kachamwa, who is the executive director of the African Development and Communication Network, better known as FemNet. Then we have Lisa Mossberg, who is representing Swedish SIDA here. Jenny Hedman, who is a policy analyst at the OECD, looking at gender equality and development. And then we have Linda Burkina, who is representing Global Affairs Canada. Welcome, everyone. Really glad to have you here. And just to note that some of the accessibility that is available in this space are being also mentioned by Camilla in the chat. So I think to begin with, what would be really great is to get an overview of the latest data and research from around official development assistance and gender equality funding. So I want to bring Jenny in to speak about this, to give us a brief presentation about this. And Jenny, I want to ask you from your perspective, working with many of these governments that have adopted feminist foreign policies, can you give us an overview of the policies and how these link with development funding, particularly for feminist movements and for women's rights organizations? Over to you, Jenny.
Thank you very much, Sashini, and thank you so much for having me today. I'm very happy to be here. So indeed, at the OECD, I coordinate the network of gender advisors in development cooperation agencies and ministries that are members of the OECD's Development Assistance Committee, so the DAC, and Linda from Canada is actually our chair of the DAC GenderNet, so happy to be here with her as well. Today there are 30 DAC members, and they are the providers of official development assistance of ODA, and they of course include not all but many of the countries that have committed to a feminist foreign policy. So starting with a few words about the kind of political and policy landscape on gender equality and development. Because we have been undertaking over the past couple of years work on preparing guidance on gender equality and development, for which we did an extensive survey of the DAC members, and we've been doing research and analysis of their policies. So nearly all DAC members in their development cooperation have strengthened their policy commitments to gender equality over the past years in plural. All but one member of the DAC highlights gender equality as a priority today. And we also see a change in the framing of what we're looking to achieve. Today, many DAC governments very explicitly identify transformative change as the means for achieving gender equality. So almost half of the DAC governments mention this and are thinking about addressing the structural and systemic discrimination and barriers to gender equality and women's rights. And many are also thinking about the inequalities that intersect with gender today. So having this so upfront is relatively new, and it is an important conceptual change that we've seen over the past maybe 5, 6, 7 years. It is a positive dynamic that goes beyond, but it also goes hand in hand with the adoption of feminist foreign policies, because both the objectives are similar and the timeline with the feminist foreign policies are also similar. So there are now 6 members of the OECD DAC that have committed to a feminist foreign policy: Sweden, Canada, Spain, France, Luxembourg, and now also Germany. A couple of other countries too, I know, but I'm speaking here today about the DAC members mainly. So I would argue that feminist foreign policies have been adopted on the one hand by countries that have already quite a strong track record on gender equality and women's rights. I'd say that they're almost confirming or reconfirming their commitments, and I think I would group Sweden and Canada into that category actually. On the other hand, we have countries adopting feminist foreign policies almost I would say, as a kind of instigator with the potential to accelerate action and funding for women's rights. And I would probably group many of the other DAC members in this category, because feminist foreign policies, of course, it's a very appealing concept at the political level, but it also creates expectations, and it sets a level of expectations on accountability, which I think we all can agree is positive. So then talking about accountability, we come to the point around resources, because when you have a feminist foreign policy, we would expect it to be underpinned by financial resources. And at the OECD, we collect and analyze data on development finance for gender equality using the DAC gender equality policy marker. So what can we observe in terms of official development assistance, ODA, or aid to gender equality? Well, firstly, it is on the rise. There is a consistent increase in development finance that integrates or mainstreams gender equality, so it's gender responsive to some extent. Today, about 45% of aid either integrates or is dedicated to gender equality. That's the total, 45% of the total aid. So when looking at the individual DAC members then, does it correspond to the ones that have feminist foreign policies? I would say yes and no. For Canada and Sweden, yes, both have very high shares of their aid that integrates or is dedicated to gender equality. There's a clear policy effort here. For Spain, I would also say yes. They have more than half of their aid that integrates gender equality. And I would stress that Spain has a very high share of aid that is dedicated to gender equality as the key, the main objective. Then there are a few other countries with feminist foreign policies that I would expect to see increase their shares of aid for gender equality over the coming years. I wanted to also take a look at the funding that is dedicated to gender equality. So this is where gender equality and women's rights are the main objective, the main only reason for designing and implementing a program. And here in that sort of piece of the pie, there's not so much movement. This remains at about 5% of aid. It corresponds to about $5.5 billion per year, with the main objective of achieving gender equality and women's rights. A lot of this is for reproductive rights and health, and also, for example, for ending gender-based violence. And then there's a part of this that is dedicated funding to women's rights organizations and feminist movements. Around $500 million per year on average in 2018 and 19 went from a DAC member to a women's rights organization or a feminist movement. And again, we have a couple of the largest contributors here on this panel today with Sweden and Canada. But this $500 million per year, it is less than 1% of all aid overall that goes to women's rights organizations and feminist movements. I think you may have heard this figure. We do have a lot of organizations that use our data and communicate around this quite striking figure that is less than 1%. But what I would say is that we at the OECD, we tend to present our statistics, our financial data in 2-year averages for statistical reasons around reliability. But I do want to say that the figure was actually higher in 2019 than in 2018. So I suspect, and I hope, I'm cautiously optimistic, that we are seeing a bit of an upwards trend here in funding for feminist movements. And I'm actually myself looking forward to the new figures, the new data on 2020 financial flows that we will have in the next couple of weeks. So to end, I do want to invite you to stay tuned, because in mid-April, we will have the very latest data on financing for gender equality and for women's rights organizations. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jenny. And I think that's a really interesting, presentation about the fact that we can see some of these improvements, and then also seeing where there is this space to push, and how can we actually strategize around that. So I want to move to our panelists now, and I think we can start with our friends from the governments who are here. So to Lisa and Laura, I think Lisa, you can go first, and then we can have Laura coming in. I have the same question for both of you, which is to find out, how has having had a feminist foreign policy in the case of Sweden, and then also having a feminist international assistance policy in the case of Canada, how has this affected how your countries provide political and financial support for funding feminist movements? And are there any challenges or fault lines that you can share in when you are implementing these policies? Yeah, so over to you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Sashini. I'm so happy for this opportunity to take part in this important conversation. And I will try to share some short about the Swedish feminist foreign policy and our development cooperation. So as you know, and as Jenny mentioned, Sweden has a long-standing commitment to gender equality and women and girls' rights. And we have a feminist government with a feminist foreign policy since 2014 already. And having a feminist government and a feminist foreign policy is important in these days. It's important because it's a recognition that we have a long way to go jointly in the world together. We do know that there is a strong resistance and opposition against women, girls, and non-binary persons right now in many parts of the world. And that progress we have achieved is now being reversed. And we know that the pandemic is making things worse. And we know, stating the obvious, that gender equality is a fundamental prerequisite for sustainable development and for achieving the sustainable development goals. So we all need to be feminists, and in practical terms, Swedish feminist foreign policy is formed around the 3 R's: rights, representation, and resources. And what does that mean for our development cooperation? Well, first of all, a feminist development cooperation is a recognition of power inequality and recognition of both legal discrimination, but also social norms that hinder women, girls, and non-binary persons. And it's a recognition of feminist organizations and movements as change makers. I think that is a key to our conversation here. And as Jenny mentioned previously, we have a long tradition of having high levels of gender integration in our development cooperation. Over 80% of everything is having gender equality as a significant or a principal objective. But with the feminist foreign policy, we have been able to provide additional funding for feminist organizations and movements. We have a relatively new, since 2018, dedicated funding stream for global interventions for gender equality to progressive change makers. And that funding stream is 1 billion Swedish kronor, something like $900 million dollars. Sorry, it's 1 0 less. Yes, 900 million. Sorry. But it's also about making the money make the best out of additional funding. It's about partnerships. We need to work together with strategic partners and cooperate and fund global partnerships that are progressive in the forefront and with the capacity to combine global normative work with work that really reach grassroots organizations and women, girls, and non-binary persons living in poverty. Concerning the figures Jenny mentioned, I think the percentage of Swedish ODA that reached women's rights organization in 2020 was 2.7%. So it's more than from many others, but we do have the ambition to continue increasing that figure. SIDA's action plan for gender equality spells out that funding to women's rights organizations is a priority and should increase. I also want to say something short about politically and policy-wise, what does it mean? Because it's not only about the money, of course. It's also about the partnerships and listening to our partners and getting support from our partners to inform and change our policies to ensure that we can play a constructive role. It's in our everyday work from SIDA side, but it's also about our Minister for Foreign Affairs, Ann Linde, recently meeting with our partners to inform her about how to play a constructive role in the work for our common agenda. Policy-wise, I would like to say something short about the importance of supporting women's rights organizations and movements in their own right, not as implementers, but in their own right and for movement building, which also, of course, is a part of building long-term and sustainable support for women rights, women human rights defenders. So it's about building trust and relations. I have the feeling I'm running out of time, Satini. Shall I say something about challenges as well now?
Yes, yeah. Yes,
I will.
Quickly.
Okay, I'll say something short about challenges, because of course it's not, of course there's always challenges. One challenge, I think I already maybe touched a little bit about it, it's of course that we, with the ambition to reach out to also informal actors and grassroots organizations, we need to challenge our systems, and we need to elaborate how we can do that as in as good way as possible. It's partly in we can work through global funds, which is excellent, and we need to also challenge our systems. Another important challenge is that we cannot lose track of gender mainstreaming. Dedicated funding for progressive feminist actors is super important, but we cannot make it a zero-sum game against good old gender mainstreaming, which is also very important and a precondition for inclusive development. So that is something that is important for us to keep in our minds, and to make sure that we increase the total chunk of funding and attention for gender equality. Finally, an important, not challenge, but opportunity is, of course, how we can combine our efforts with efforts of philanthropic donors, because it's different. We do different things with different preconditions, but together we can achieve a lot and maybe provide more resources into the important system. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you for noting the importance of various kinds of partnerships to really, drive this forward. I'll hand it to you, Laura, for the same question about your experiences and then also challenges. Sorry to Linda. I'm so sorry to Linda.
It's okay. But Laura on my team, who you know well, Seshni, we look very alike, so it happens a lot. So it's no problem at all. So thank you so much for having us here, and really excited to be on this panel and to talk about how supporting women's rights organizations and supporting feminist movements and movement building is key to feminist foreign policy. And I think it is an amazing shift that's happened, as Jenny noted, over the past few years. Canada has been implementing a feminist foreign policy since 2016, and it's based on decades of work to advance human rights and gender equality as a key component of foreign policy. Our feminist foreign policy is inclusive, intersectional, transformative, and it's grounded in human rights, and it's cross-cutting across our diplomatic, trade, security, development, and consular services. What it means is, in practice, is that we've implemented feminist policies across those policies within our department, including a feminist international assistance policy, an inclusive trade policy, our agenda on women, peace, and security, for example, and our defense policy. But with regard to the feminist international assistance policy, this is where we've seen a real shift in terms of funding and supporting women's rights organizations. And the reason for that is very similar to what was described by Lisa, which is that we believe that recognizing and supporting gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls is a catalyst and a precursor to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. And we also believe in the contribution that feminist movements and women's rights organizations can and are making to achieving those development goals and to making transformative change happen in their communities. And so within the Feminist International Assistance Policy, our core action area is advancing gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. And within that core action area, we have a key point of that policy, which is around supporting feminist movements and advancing support for women's rights organizations. And we committed to supporting these organizations with the launch of the Feminist International Assistance Policy. And what came with that were two key initiatives. One being the Equality Fund, which Canada provided $300 million of seed funding to allow for a sustainable source of funding for women's rights organizations in the long term through some of those partnerships that Lisa was just talking about. So bringing together private sector and government partners to advance funding for women's rights organizations and providing a sustainable source of funding and grant making in the long term for women's rights organizations. At the same time, we also implemented the Women's Voice and Leadership Program, which was a 5-year program for $150 million. And the purpose of that program was to provide capacity building funding, as well as fast and responsive funding to women's rights organizations globally. So between those two programs, we have some targeted support for women's rights organizations happening through the Feminist International Assistance Policy, and placing that core action area of supporting gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, and that enabling feature of supporting women's rights organizations right in the Feminist International Assistance Policy was key in terms of making sure that that could happen in the right way. We also have implemented a how feature of our policy, which is our feminist approach to working within the department. And what that asks all of the staff to do is to think about taking a feminist approach in everything they do. And key to taking a feminist approach is working with and engaging women's rights organizations in policymaking, in decision making, and thinking about who needs to be at the table. Are we making inclusive decisions? Are we thinking about the work that women's rights organizations are doing and the change that they're affecting on the ground? Are we thinking about individual circumstances that are needed to drive gender equality in different contexts globally? And so taking the policy along with the feminist approach has really helped us to advance our support for women's rights organizations and feminist movements in our international assistance. And we've had good success in doing that. In the Women's Voice and Leadership Program, for example, it's being delivered in 33 countries. And initially we had set out to support 400 women's rights organizations through that program. And we've actually managed to support 800 women's rights organizations. And we've seen some key shifts in network building, in sustainability, and in those women's rights organizations' ability to respond quickly in situations of crisis, for example. Because the Women's Voice and Leadership Program provides both core funding and fast responsive funding, and it's based in that idea, as Lisa noted, in terms of supporting women's rights organizations to work towards their mandate and set their own goals, rather than funding them thematically based on our predetermined policy decisions and thinking around sort of what should happen in certain contexts. It allowed these organizations to respond very quickly in the context of COVID-19 and to help people in their communities with tailored work that would help protect the rights of women and girls and provide tailored services that other organizations may have missed because they're not thinking in the same way that women's rights organizations may be working and thinking on the ground. So we're definitely seeing a shift in policy and a shift in thinking that way, which I think is really important. Am I running out of time, Sashini? Or shall I talk about a couple of the challenges?
A couple of challenges, please, and then you can wrap up.
Okay, perfect. So, I mean, I think similar to Lisa, I think the challenges that we're facing are very similar. I think what we've found is, despite a real wish and intent by the government of Canada to support women's rights organizations, and particularly local women's rights organizations, our bureaucracy wasn't necessarily fit for purpose to do that at the outset. So it took us a little bit of time to shift that mindset around thinking about supporting movements and women's rights organizations for the value of movements and women's rights organizations, and not trying to sort of fit that support into that thematic box, first of all, but also to creating those the funding mechanisms that can make that funding flexible and useful and attainable and accessible to women's rights organizations. And I think that's a challenge for all bureaucracies, I think, both on the philanthropic side, large foundations, and also the government side. And I think partnerships like the Global Alliance for Sustainable Feminist Movements, and also individual partnerships where there can be, like the Equality Fund, for example, which was designed hand in hand with women's rights organizations and with partners, are really good opportunities to take some of those challenges head on and to say, okay, how can we do things differently? And how can we sort of get out of that bureaucratic box and build those relationships of trust, because we're all working towards the same goal. And so I think the challenge is changing that mindset. And I think over time, I think the challenge will be to sort of change those instincts rather than thinking,
I'm trying to figure out whether it's my internet or Linda's.
I think Linda's.
All right. Let's give it a few seconds. Okay. I think we can ask Linda to finish that thought when she comes back. But I think, yeah, just before, like, we heard the, but I think the piece about building relationships of trust is also, really key. And I'm really glad that Linda brought this up. And I think this really moves us to speakers from civil society who are here, Ambika and Memory. And before I go into the question with Ambika and Memory, I also want to remind all of you that we have the Q&A feature here, where you can add any questions that might, already be starting to simmer, so that we can, move into a discussion as well. So Ambika and Memory, I think, like, we've heard a lot about, what is working with feminist foreign policy and these approaches to feminist funding. And I think as much as there is, so much potential for feminist foreign policy to drive funding and political commitment, there are also feminist critiques, I think, especially from the global South, about, is this really, like, replicating certain world orders? Or like, can it be said that sometimes, feminist foreign policy, like, also contradicts the domestic policies of certain countries, or, like, don't confront certain contradictions? Because as feminists, where, we have intersectional politics, where we see that gender equality is, intertwined very firmly with economic justice and environmental justice, with climate justice, and sometimes we see these contradictions. So the question I want to ask both of you is, when you engage with feminist foreign policy, like, how do these critiques affect that engagement? And then also, do you see a cycle between receiving support for feminist movements and feminist policies, and then there being more support for feminist movements as a result of that. So do you see this as a reinforcing relationship? So 2 questions: how do some of these feminist critiques affect how you engage with feminist foreign policy? And then this relationship between funding and stronger movements. Ambika, if you want to start, and then we can follow with Mary.
Yes, thank you, Sajini, and good evening to everybody from India. These are very big questions and very hard questions to answer in a short time span, but I want to pick up in trying to answer that question, in both your questions a little bit, what Lisa had said as movements as change makers. And I think that is one of the biggest, not failings, but obstacles that we see when it comes to the funding that comes to countries and organizations that are working in countries like India. And I speak mostly for India, given that the research that we are doing on what looks like more gender mainstreaming in India's foreign policy. We've been looking at this research for the last couple of years. We've been learning from other countries that have gone before us and trying to understand what it means for the Indian context. And in that research, we've obviously spoken to, I think now with the exception of Chile, every single other country that has embarked on this movement, and other countries that are thinking about embarking on the movement. And what we are understanding is that this idea of what a feminist movement is, what a women's rights organization looks like, and what a change maker is sometimes different from what you might see in countries that might be in Europe or in North America or in South America or in Africa, or then in my case in South Asia or in other parts of Asia. And I think that is one of the things that we really need to think about. And I know Lisa and Linda both touched upon that. So it was really heartening to hear that that this mindset is changing. And I've seen it changing. And I mean, I've been working in this space for almost 20 years now. So I have seen the change happen. But I think now that when we think about feminist foreign policy or feminist movements, what does that mean in an Indian context? I think needs to be understood a lot more deeply, a lot more from a nuanced perspective. And then how do countries like Canada, Sweden deploy the funds that they have for these movements? And I have no doubt that nuance is very different, again, than when you go to a South Africa, for example, or in Egypt, or even Bangladesh, which is right next door to me. So that is missing a little bit. I'll give a very small example in that I was having a conversation with some partners earlier today, and they were talking about a program that they're doing with women at the field level on water and watershed management. And along with that, and there's a lot of money that goes for programs for women at the field level on watershed management in India and many parts of the world as well. But they were trying to get money to also sensitize men in that same kind of program. And it was really hard to get money for something like that, because that program is not necessarily considered by Western funders as a women's rights movement or a feminist movement or a movement that's going to ultimately have positive cascading effects. So I think it's important to realize that in a context like India, even bringing money to that kind of program is really important. And how then can something like that be broadened? How can that idea be broadened? I think is important to think about. It's important to consider when you're doing the planning. And then again, I go back to what both Lisa and Linda mentioned, that there is now this concept of partnerships. How do we understand the difference in the different countries' nuances? And I mean, I'm going to say in India, it's not just a country's nuance, it's like a community nuance, where if you're in the north, south, east, or west, each state is different. So how do we ensure, then from my side as well, and organizations in the country, how do we ensure that all of these nuances, all of these differences are put forth in a manner that is easier to understand for our partners around the world. That is my responsibility, and that's something that we're trying to work on. And so that then what happens with the money, with the learnings, with the experiences, is done in a much more positive manner. So I think I don't want to dwell on the critics, but how this can be then sort of changed for the better going forward. I think that, so I go back to just saying that we have to a little bit rethink what we consider as a feminist movement, because some of those very core underlying concepts might be very different. So in that sense, how can we broaden this idea of a feminist movement? Because at the very core of it, I see a feminist movement as an inclusive movement. And so if we don't broaden that idea, then it's not really inclusive to begin with. So I'm coming at it from that side, and I think that's an important point I wanted to put across. I know it's a little bit of a roundabout answer, Sachini, to your question, but I think it was important to ensure that, you know, when we have these kind of conversations, we arrive at a point where we're like, okay, there are all these different ideas and these differences. How can we bring them together, and then how can we take them forward in a manner that's most effective for the place that they are intended, whether it is a village in India or an urban space in a city in a different country in Africa or in another part of Asia. So I wanted to just flag some of those thoughts. I'd be happy to come back to this if there was any more specific questions. And I'd love to hear what Memory has to say from all her fantastic work that I've been reading about today.
Thank you, Ambika. And I think you raised that really important point, like, which I know Lisa and Linda also touched on earlier about this feedback loop as well, right? Like, also, how do we shape, how these priorities are, like, articulated, and then also, like, where is it going, and what are those needs, and what are those, like, specificities. So that was a really important point. Thank you. Memory, over to you now.
Thank you so much, Sachin. And, I totally agree. This is quite a difficult question. But I think when we talk about some of the contradictions with feminist foreign policy, I think we've seen really, in the past week during CSW, we heard a lot from the governments of Sweden, France, Mexico, governments which have feminist foreign policy and what they've done in terms of really advancing what a feminist foreign policy has really done. And I think most of it is really steeped in terms of, yes, overseas development assistance, but also domestically looking at, putting in policies, responding to issues that are critical, like care. We saw with the government of Mexico really pushing for a global alliance of care, which is really commendable. But I think when it comes to some of them, we don't hear a lot, I should say, when you look at the governments who have feminist foreign policy, speak out and have strong political commitment and voice on issues like silencing the guns on the continent in Africa. We know that some of the governments which have feminist foreign policy among the top 5, among the top 10 in terms of being the governments that supply and export weapons onto the continent. So there is that contradiction to say, yes, you're talking a lot around feminist foreign policy, but you're not doing so much in terms of speaking out in terms of some of the agendas which are very neo-colonial. We saw, right now we do know, like, some of the conflicts in West Africa, issues to do with monetary sovereignty, in terms of the CEF, for example. So there's that sort of like, yes, there's support for gender equality, support for feminist movement, but not so much in terms of having those, what I would talk about, foreign policy difficult conversations, because we also find that when it comes to some of those spaces, women's movements are not even in those spaces to start with. Women's rights organizations are not even engaging with some of the foreign ministers, permanent missions, where they're discussing issues around peace and security. You find, and I'm just speaking from our experience and maybe some of our networks, most of them are working in the front lines, they're working at the community level, and to be able to be in this space where most foreign policy issues around trade is being negotiated, we don't see a lot of support, or we don't see or hear a lot in terms of women's movements, women's rights organizations in those spaces. And I think, so when, and largely because I think there's still that closing of even just civic space. So it's just not women's rights organizations, but it's civic space. I'll give an example of the EU-AU summit, for example. The EU, European Union and African Union summit, which happened in February. It was really a closed, sort of like when the actual negotiations were happening, it was close to civil society as a whole, and more so for even like women's rights organizations, or having a very strong, you don't hear it's not coherent. What is in the feminist policy and what is discussed in these spaces is not really coherent, like it's not consistent in terms of really challenging issues around inequality between the states, even in representation, in terms of, so I still feel there's need for the governments with feminist foreign policy to really start being very vocal and start influencing some of those issues. We look at macroeconomic issues. We look at the climate negotiations, discussions, global north, global south. And when it comes to some of those issues, there is a lot of silencing. But of course, we know some of the governments with feminist foreign policy do really try in terms of creating space for civil society, for women's rights organizations to engage. But it's not consistent, and I don't think it's enough. I think another issue also is issues around migration policy, issues around treatment of indigenous persons, diaspora communities. So the human rights, the underpinning of feminist foreign policy is really a human rights approach. It's really centered on that. But somehow when the governments with feminist foreign policy and some of the policies they make around migration, they don't consider some of those basic tenets of the right to movement, etc. And I know it's complex, but I think that should be the measure in terms of how well feminist foreign policy is being implemented. So yes, I think the discomforting conversations, some of those critical issues, I think we should be actually creating spaces. The governments with feminist foreign policy should be creating spaces and also questioning some of those hegemonic power, which transcend when we talk around the geopolitical issues. But also to say, having said that, in terms of our engaging, I think for us, we find that having feminist foreign policy creates an avenue also for us to start engaging in terms of now actually questioning to say, yes, there is support to movements, so how should it look like? So I think it also then creates, having within the governments feminists who really listen and who are willing to engage with the movements and ensure that even when the discussions are, when it's tabled within the parliament, they can create, it could be funding streams that can actually respond not to the orthodox kind of funding, but I think what has already been said around built on trust, which has flexibility in it, which is also responsive as well. So maybe I'll stop and go back to you, Sachin, and maybe, yes, very happy and open to discuss further.
Thank you, Memory, and thank you so much for bringing this point about space for civil society, because I think that is also key to this political support for feminist movements that we are talking about, and how feminist foreign policy can, what is the potential for feminist foreign policy to drive that kind of support, which is also integral to the financial support. I think, Ambika, you wanted to add a point, so we'll do that. And then we'll go into, I think, a few of the questions that are coming up. And yeah, I'm going to switch my video off.
Thank you, Sachin. I just wanted to add on to what Memory was saying, as writing furiously as she's talking, but this, I think it's important for funding organizations that are looking to fund, any sort of movement, need to little bit redefine what their idea of a feminist movement is, or a women's right movement is, because there's a lot of different organizations now I see, especially in India, coming up that might not have a very typical looking makeup of what one used to consider as a women's rights movement organization or a feminist organization. Maybe it doesn't say so clearly in their charter, but they are doing the work that needs to be done to get to that point. So they should also then be considered when it comes to funding or any kind of other assistance that they might require. So I think that a little bit change in wording might be really helpful to broaden that scope. Yeah, thanks for letting me step in here.
No worries, thank you. Yeah, thank you for adding that. So I think if the panelists don't mind, maybe we can address some of the questions and weave them together with, some of what we're going to talk about next. And I think this is a really good, segue into, what Memory was also talking about, and then Ambika also about, feminist movements, what do they look like, and, also then how do we really look at the piece around, political support and civil society participation. And I think in that sense, if we can, speak to you, Lisa and Linda, and Linda, hopefully you can also complete the thought that, we were all waiting to hear. But I think one question that has come up is really to know more about, because you talk about, that bureaucracy is really not, fit for purpose. Both of you talked about that. And I think there are questions about, what are some of the concrete steps that have been taken in order to address some of these challenges that you talk about. And then also in terms of, the feminist, the women's funds and the feminist funds. So what is their role, and vis-a-vis, how these, how this movement of funding happens, and for you, how can governments actually, approach women's funds in order to, understand how they can be a partner in this ecosystem that you talked about. Yeah, so those two questions. Lisa, do you want to go first?
Sure, thank you. And I don't know where to start because there are so many important things on the table. And thank you very much, Ambika and Memory, also for putting the questions there on the table. I'm afraid I can't only answer to your questions, Sajini, because I think it's really, really important to put on the table important questions of policy coherence. Of course, it is a huge commitment to pursue a feminist foreign policy, and I think everyone is aware that it's work in progress. And I think one key to making it as good as possible is the partnerships. To conversations like this one and partnerships where our partners challenge us. And of course, the conversation in between governments with feminist foreign policy to learn and to challenge themselves, but also in between a country like mine and our partners from all over the world to learn and together find solutions, because that's very much key, I think. And also, I think important things that we've been discussing here is that yes, we are all aware and need to be very, very aware of the colonial structures we are still having in the world and the power that comes with that. I think I'm glad to say at least that we do have quite some discussions within SIDA right now on how to figure out how to handle that fact and to become as good partner as possible. And we're also looking very much into solutions to make the ambition to provide support that is South-led, partners that are South-based, and so on, a reality. We're also learning a lot from partners on new ways of understanding and assessing and doing programs. We are learning about participatory grant making, for instance, referring very much to what you were saying, Ambika, that of course we don't know best here what is done, what is needed in India. Of course, it's organizations in India that knows that. I fully agree. Then, Sajini, you were saying how to make governments fit for purpose. I don't really agree that we're not fit for purpose, but we can always improve, of course. And I think it's important also to see, as I mentioned, the different role of different kind of money and different kind of donors, because being a state authority comes with one kind of responsibility and accountability to partners, but also to the Swedish taxpayers. That is something we need to bear in mind, and we will probably always be the one donor that asks for one more report and so on. But we want to elaborate together with partners how to make sense of them. For the challenge of reaching out as far as possible, yes, our partnership with a couple of women's funds is really, really important as in a partnership, but also as a mechanism to reach out, to reach out with funding in a good way and to provide support to different parts of the important feminist ecosystem. One part is the movement building to make sure that there are organizations that can do their job long term and with safety, but also, of course, more short-term support to women human rights defenders that are under threat today or tomorrow that need support immediately. So different kinds of support for different reasons, of course. I'm not sure. Did I respond to the question at all? But maybe Linda, make your take.
You did. And I think Linda has many questions here as well. So over to you, Linda.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm not going to put my video just in case that happens again. And thank you, everyone, for your patience with me I mean, it has to happen at least one in every meeting, right? That someone gets disconnected. So today it was me. There have been a lot of questions in the chat about how donors and governments can make funding for women's rights organizations and for other members of civil society more flexible. And I mean, I think to Lisa's point around feminist foreign policy being a work in progress, that part of the work in terms of making funding more flexible, more responsive, is also a work in progress. And we recognize that our two initiatives, both the Equality Fund and the Women's Voice and Leadership Program, they're both less than 5 years old. So we're learning how to do that. I think one thing that's been important is recognizing the need to provide core funding to organizations so that they can build themselves as organizations and have the funding they need to be able to operate and to fulfill their mandates. That is definitely a shift. So shifting from project-based funding, which is, you know, the way that we normally fund international assistance, to funding the core mandates of those organizations and allowing them to set those mandates themselves and not coming into programs or projects with a preconceived notion of what that end result should be. And so that's really, when you talk about having a partnership and shifting power and letting go, that's not very easy sometimes for governments or funders to say, you know what, I'm not going to tell you what the solution is. You are in your community and you know. And so it sounds very simple, but I think that's really part of it. And that's not always easy. So I think that's part of it. I think also providing an opportunity to have some fast and flexible funding, and you know, the Equality Fund could jump in on that, probably around making sure that there's funding there so that women's rights organizations can respond in times of crisis. And there's great funds, women's funds that are out there that are doing work like that, Urgent Action Fund and other funds. And so the other question that people had was, how can governments engage with women's funds? And I just want to put a plug in here for the Global Alliance for Sustainable Feminist Movements, because that's exactly what the Global Alliance is meant to do. It's to bring together donors, both government donors and philanthropic donors, with women's funds and women's rights organizations to talk about some of these solutions. Where are the blocks in terms of donors engaging with women's funds? What role do women's funds play in the ecosystem of funding for feminist movements and women's rights organizations? What do women's rights organizations need in order to operate, in order to make change in their communities, in their countries, in their regions? How can those networks be built? And what is the role of government and philanthropic donors in supporting that? And also, what has worked? What's working well right now in terms of some of the mechanisms that donors have set up? What have been some of those stumbling blocks? And what are some of the solutions? I think there was also a long discussion on bringing women's rights organizations and feminist movements to the table, to decision-making spaces. I think the Alliance could also play a really important role in having some of those discussions. What mechanisms could governments put in place to make that happen? What are ways to do that in regional, national, multilateral fora? How can we as an alliance help that side of it, that political side of support of it, that transformational change in terms of how governments and others are making decisions? How can that happen? How can the alliance support that change? So I think that group, in terms of bringing together the funders, the women's rights organizations, the women's funds together in one place to talk about some of these tough policy issues, is a massive opportunity to try to effectuate change. But it's not going to have as much change if not as many governments, not as many women's rights organizations, not as many women's funds are joining. So we would love to have everyone join us in this conversation, because I think it's really important. And it tackles a very key piece of feminist foreign policy, which is bringing women's rights organizations to the table and supporting them as organizations so that they have both the capacity in terms of fulfilling their own mandates, but also they have the space to be able to join those conversations and not constantly doing it on the side of their desk because they don't have that support. So I hope I'm making sense, but that's what that's my plug, because that's our goal, that's our objective.
Thank you, Linda. And I think Rachel from the Global Alliance has been adding some links in the chat on how, if you're interested, how you can get more information. So we have the forms in the chat. And I think with that, I'm seeing another question which that I think I want to pose to Ambika and Memory. And so this question is really and I think, I also highlighted this somewhere about the piece of building trust, right? And I think this is also particularly relevant to the Global Alliance as well, because I think as we figure out, the shape of the alliance, there is a need to understand, between these different groups of stakeholders who are coming together, how do we continue to build trust? So Memory and Ambika, if you can, speak a bit more about the role of trust and the kind of the challenges and benefits there are when you center trust-based relationships with the feminist movements. And then I think also, I think it would be great to hear from you, based on your experience, specifically in the context of Global South governments. How do we go about this? What are the entry points to, having this conversation in some of our contexts as well? Ambika, do you want to start, or Memory, whoever? Memory?
Yes, thank you so much, Sachin. Yes, so maybe I can just speak, I think when it comes to trust-based feminist movements and also having those relationships with funders, I think we've really seen it work. I think there's some demonstrable evidence. I know a lot of our work is really about learning, but also experimenting, but also seeing where it has worked and what has worked. But one thing that what I think has really worked is where we have feminist funders or women's rights funders who are able to channel funding right to the community levels or to different communities working at different levels, especially on the things and issues which are largely invisible. So in supporting more than anything, the running of the organizations, the institutional support. I think for me, that is where a lot of trust is required in terms of really recognizing and putting up different funding models that can support institutional for the different movements to be able to do their work in terms of really what they are mandated to, and not so much the activity-based sort of log frame way. So I think this is something that when organizations and movements are supported to do their work, they're able to really respond. So trusting that yes, organizations were actually, most of them created to actually respond to a particular issue. Most of the organic organizations that we see, or the organic movements that we see, sometimes they just need support to enable them to activate their work, but also to sustain their work in terms of following up. And we've seen, especially the work that we do at Femnet on advocacy, how some of it takes a long, long time in terms of actually seeing the change, in terms of the shift. So sometimes a year can go. It's not like people are not working, but really trusting that even the steps and the different advocacy moments are actually being supported. So I think we have seen some of those models working. We got support to support networks of networks in a program which we call Stitch, and it was just supporting young women's network to maybe come up with their strategic plan, to put in the structures which would then allow them to receive the kind of funding, to build an audit trail, so that when they do get funding, they are also accountable to, and they have the systems which will allow trust for funders to actually give them funding. So I think that support, when we talk of capacity strengthening, it should not just be locked in terms of training. Yes, it should be in building knowledge, but also supporting some of those reinforcing structural issues, a software to enable them to have their meetings, things, self-care, things that we know can actually sustain movements. And I think the other comments, maybe I'll leave it for Ambika, but maybe I can come back again. Session, is that okay?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Memory.
Thank you, Memory. I feel like you've said most of everything I was going to say, so it makes my my job a little easier. But I want to add here is from my own experience a little bit. When I co-founded Cover9 Initiative with my business partner Priyanka Bide, we are a new young organization in that sense. We are female-led and female-founded, and at this moment have a all-female team, which is great, but it's not by design. We're happy to have men come and work with us as well. But because we are new, there's a lot of barriers, which I'm sure a lot of people will understand. As a new organization, it's harder to get to the people you need to get to. It's harder to get to the funding that you need to be able to do the work that you need to do. And I think this is an important point to put across to organizations, funders, governments that are coming into India or any other country, is that maybe break out a little bit out of those cycles that you have been funding, that you've been working with for many years or many decades, and try and find all the other organizations as well that are doing the work that, again, might not fit that very specific definition, but are doing the work that needs to be done. Now, that work might be ground level work, that work might be research, that work might be advocacy, that work might be a mix of all of this. And so I think it's important then for or grant organizations to look a little bit beyond what they already know. And in that sense, I think it's also important for the embassies within those countries to then also look beyond what they already know, so that you have a wider pool to pick from. And I think that's really important. And it's not just for countries that are coming to India, but I would say for India to do outside of this country as well. We've been tracking the development assistance that the Indian Foreign Ministry does in other countries, and I would say this is true for the Indian government as well. They need to look beyond some of the usual actors that they might have been working with. So in that sense, a little bit of disruption is good in how we build these relationships going forward. There's about trust. I mean, the Memory has spoken, and I think it's just a matter of, like, you have to trust the people that you've decided to work with, and not micromanage as much, because you have to realize that, as Sajni, as you said already, that they know the conditions probably better than you may or may not know in some cases. So that trust just needs to be built. It's built out of open conversation. It's built out of conversations like this. So in that sense, I think it's great what CFFP is doing. It's built out of just continuing this conversation going forward, and it's built out of a mutual understanding of what terms, words, and definitions mean. So I think that's also then becomes really important. Sajni, I know there was a second question. I'm not sure I answered that, but if you want to repeat it, I can try. And I'm sorry, I'm a little bit blanking on the second question.
No, that's fine. And I think memory, like we'll maybe talk about that a bit, and then we can go into the, I think we'll start the final remarks with memory. Memory, maybe you can talk about that a bit and then go into your final remarks. And then we'll speak to Lisa, Linda, Jenny, and wrap up with Ambika with your final remarks. So memory, if you want to talk about the entry points for Global South governments, and then any other remarks you have.
Yeah, thanks, Sachin. So I think for Global South governments, Libya is the first African country to have a feminist foreign policy. So it's still young. We are watching. We hope we can see more to that. But we've also seen some Global South governments which are really pushing for feminist principles. I can name South Africa, for example. Malawi, in a way, they might not say it, but we also see in terms of how they embrace engaging women's leadership and making sure that, women are part of the leadership. So I think for most African governments, the entry point is really first pushing to have the representation of women in the policy spaces, and also having more women in the foreign service as well, having more women to lead in departments of ministries of defense, in the judiciary, so we've seen a little bit around that, but it's also to say who should be so that allows, because there's so much push for having equality in terms of representation in positions of power and positions of leadership. But I think it also comes with a lot of work and support to have these to have the right people in those positions as well. Otherwise, it would be just a reinforcement of the patriarchal oppression, ideology, and pushing like that. So there's need to also reinforce to say we need to have more women, but also women who are coming from the feminist movements to enter into the policy space to push a feminist agenda. I know we hear a lot of utterances from leaders who call themselves feminists, but really when it comes to what they are doing, it's just really tokenistic and, sort of like capturing and saying, if I'm feminist, then and I think that's something to really guard against as well, and to also look out for as well. And I think they could be also in terms of, I think one of the things that I also wanted to say is, I think our having some of the governments who have feminist foreign policy and who are working with our governments and supporting, for example, budget support. I think one thing that can actually be helpful and which can also support is to also insist in having, for example, say the government of Sweden is going to give a government from the Global South some budgetary support with conditions in terms of pushing for gender equality, with conditions. I think for me, those should be some of the acceptable conditions for governments who get government or budgetary support to be able to really demonstrate, to say, yes, there should be 50% participation. This investment should really ensure that it's supporting, it supports young women. This support is supporting women with disability, people living in informal settings, the whole intersectional LGBTQ or non-binary. So really, if there has to be any conditions for funding, particularly funding coming from feminist foreign policy governments, then it should also come with some of those conditions and principles to really push for a feminist agenda as well. And I think just in ending, I think we need more support in terms of really opening civic space. I think there's so much that can be done. When civic space is closing and activists, women's rights organizations find it more and more difficult to influence policies. And we say, yes, there could be signing of policies, but I think there is need to support really accountability of most of the commitments which are being made, and to really ensure that if it is funding gets to women, funding really gets to the groups that we know have been really stretched out, especially with the COVID, are really vulnerable, especially to the climate, to the impacts around climate. But I think lastly, I think being more bolder in terms of really addressing some of those contradictions and continuing to open the space and the platforms for listening and for also being courageous enough to challenge some of those critical political issues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Memory, and for those very constructive recommendations. So I think we'll go into final remarks from others. I think let's start with Lisa, Linda, Jenny, and then Ambika.
Thank you so much. I think it's been a very, very good conversation and really, really important questions that we need to solve together on the table. I would like to mention one thing. I saw an important question in the chat or in the question and answer column, and that is, how can we guarantee a long-term commitment to a feminist foreign policy? And I think we need to be honest and say that we can't, because that it's a political direction. But I think that we can do the very best out of having a feminist foreign policy and building up the strength of it by creating strong partnerships and by learning and by making the concept of a feminist foreign policy integrated in our everyday work by proving how it is not an add-on, but it's a tool for increased relevance of what we do, of our policies or our operations, and also increased efficiency of what we're doing. Because what we're learning from our feminist partners is not just what is the most relevant to do, and also how to do it. And I think one good example is how we have learned a lot during the last year of how a feminist approach can make our work for environment and climate change much better, much more relevant. And I think those examples is the best guarantee for the future, how to pursue long-term partnerships for a feminist foreign policy. And maybe my most important takeaway from this conversation is, of course, trust and partnerships, how to learn from each other and challenge each other and to really have good conversations. So I'm very, very happy for the fora we have for that with the Global Alliance for Sustainable Feminist Movements. We are only in the beginning of that important work. And also, I think great thanks to Center for Feminist Foreign Policy for arranging, co-organizing this. It's excellent. We need to talk about what we're doing and to continue improving. So thank you.
Thank you, Lisa. Do you want me to jump in, Sashini? yeah, I won't take up too much time because I want to give a chance to everyone to give their closing remarks, but just picking up on what Lisa said and some of the things that I've heard. I mean, one of the things that I heard from memory that I think is so important is around patience for transformational change. And that's really around changing our mindset in terms of how we define, quote unquote, a result, right? So, you know, no country has achieved gender equality. It takes time, and I think we need to trust in the process, and that can be very difficult. It can be a very difficult shift to make. So I think it truly is a shifting mindset. And just to pick up on what Lisa said in terms of how to sort of entrench feminist foreign policy, I agree with her. You know, there's no guarantees ever, but I think the more that feminist ways of working and are entrenched in the way that that we work every day, the more people will see the value of those ways of working, and it will become more of an instinct, as Lisa mentioned, rather than an afterthought. And that, of course, will take time, but I think little by little, as these ways of working are changed and these trust-based relationships are built, those relationships will not be lost based on you know, the changing winds of time. So I think it's important to keep working at it and to really build it into the way that we work every day, and to question ourselves, question decisions we make, and ways that we set things up, and ways that we work, and ask if we're modeling a feminist way of working every day, and if not, what needs to change, and how can we do better every day. And so I appreciate this opportunity absolutely for this conversation, because I think it's really important to ask those questions, and to really recognize both the imperfection and that mistakes will be made, but also the willingness to work together in partnership to really advance this agenda. So I really, really appreciate it, and also just really appreciate placing support for women's rights organizations in the feminist foreign policy discussion is absolutely crucial and important. And so we look forward to further conversations through this forum and through the Global Alliance as well. And just really appreciate the opportunity for being here. Thanks.
Jenny, please go ahead.
Thank you. Thanks so much. I think this has been a great discussion with so many excellent points made already. So I wanted to try and not repeat anything that has been said, but I wanted to actually say something quite similar to what Linda said that there at the very end, which was around kind of getting our own house in order a little bit. I do think that when it comes to the foreign ministries and the development cooperation agencies, including those that are implementing feminist foreign policies, I think it's about also looking at what are their internal policies, what do they look like in terms of gender equality and in terms of a feminist approach. Are they actually walking the talk? Are there human resources policies gender equal, and are there women in leadership positions? So that, I think, is a really important sort of basis for all of this that we've been talking about today. And it's something also that we address in this guidance on gender equality that I was talking about that will come out later this year. Then maybe just to also pick up on this point a little bit that has been made by Memory and others around being in the right spaces. It was just so striking to me how important it is for sort of representatives from feminist movements and women's rights organizations to be in the rooms, probably kind of different and larger rooms than this one, where I think we all kind of are on the same page and have the knowledge around these issues. And I was thinking about that when one of the members of the DAC GenderNet, who is working in a government that doesn't have a feminist foreign policy, she said to me, oh, you know, my director general was in a meeting where there was a women's rights organization speaking, and he realized how important it is to work with this type of actors, and I absolutely want us to fund them. What do we do? How do I do this? I want to do it now. And I was thinking, wow, it's just such a clear and effective chain of events that, you know, we want to recreate. It's certainly something that's always on my mind, because at the OECD we organize a lot of events and meetings, but I think we all need to keep that in our minds. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jenny. And over to you, Ambika.
Yeah, thank you, Sajini. I just will end on a positive note to say that it's really great to hear that so many of us are in the same boat, so to speak. So it's encouraging that we can learn from each other and help each other. And from everything that Lisa, Jenny, and Linda said, it gives us a lot of optimism that things are going to change and that we can all make this change happen. So that's all. I mean, and everything that everybody else said, I will just echo, but end on this positive note to say thank you to the work that they are doing, to the work that Memory is doing, to the work that you are doing, Sajini, and of course to everything that CFFP and Christina and her entire team is doing. I would not be in this space doing the work that we are doing on exploring something similar in India if it wasn't for CFFP and Christina. So I want to big shout out to them. More especially. So thank you everyone for listening, and I will say good night now from India.
Thank you very much, Ambika. And yeah, I think everyone has really I think crystallized some of what we have been talking about here. And I think if we are to quickly say what are a few key takeaways that we have from here, I think the importance of multi-stakeholder partnerships were really emphasized, and building relationships of trust, and the role of feminist funds in also doing this was emphasized. And how can we go beyond the usual actors, and also look at civil society and political society. How do we make sure that feminist movements are really engaged in the policymaking space, and then also the need for funding and feminist foreign policy really be context specific. How do we respond to these specific needs, and shifting power, and from questioning hegemonic power and questioning some of these difficult contradictions that we are sitting with. So I think the consensus is that we need more conversations like this, and I think we very much agree with that. So thank you to the Center for Foreign Policy. And I also want to say thank you to Rachel and our colleagues from AVID who have been supporting us from behind the scenes. Thank you to our interpreters, and then very much a big thank you to our fabulous speakers who brought in so much for us to think about. Thank you, and good night, and have a good day, everyone.